welcome. Um, let me. Um, I'm going to restrict my presentation to 30 to 35 minutes, hopefully, and we will probably take questions at the end because it's very difficult with microphones on, and especially because you'll be listening to, and it leads to this echo problem. So at the end, then we will keep the question and answer session. So I'm going to start sharing the slide and start right away. Um, so welcome, and this is a talk about the concept of diffuse interface. And there are two things that I'm going to talk, and I'm going to talk about them in parallel. One is the material science aspect. So we will talk about the thermodynamics, the transport, and things like that. As we are doing it, I also want to talk about the mathematical aspects associated with the concept of diffuse interface. And you will see that sometimes dealing with diffuse interfaces requires slightly more involved mathematics than what you would otherwise use. And there is a nice twist in the end, which is mathematical in nature, and that is involving the solution of partial differential equations. So we will come to that towards the end. So here is the outline of the talk. I first want to talk about interfaces themselves. What are they, and how do they look? And then we will talk about how to do the thermodynamics and the transport for systems with interfaces. And then we will talk about concept of interfaces in solving partial differential equations. And I will end with a short summary. I want to make a few disclaimers before we proceed further in the talk. I'm going to make some claims. They are neither historically nor chronologically very accurate. But the real way in which these concepts are developed is too complex. People have been going back and forth. For the sake of making the narrative simpler, I'm going to proceed from one to the other, as if that is how things improved. This need not be the case. And what I'm going to present is not the complete picture. This is one point of view, and it is my point of view among many which are available. So bear with me if you have a different point of view. Hopefully, there is something new for you to think about. I'm also trying to make this presentation pedagogical. So some of the things that I'm going to show is already known to you. The hope is that I will also tell something which is new. And I'm not going to go too much into the technical details. I have tried to keep the equations minimal. Maybe there are only 2 or 3 equations. But those of you who are interested in technical details, we can continue discussions outside of this seminar. So first we will talk about interfaces. And interfaces are very common, and they are also very important. And this is a microstructure of a nickel-based superalloy. And as you can see, there is the gamma prime precipitates, Ni3Al precipitates. They are in a gamma matrix. So the first interface that you see is a gamma prime interface. And then there is a grain boundary here. Okay. Along the grain boundary, again, the gamma prime has precipitated. So you have the gamma prime gamma interface, and between two gammas, there is this grain boundary. And in this case, there is also precipitation of some carbides at the grain boundary. So you have the carbide precipitate interface or carbide matrix interface. And so one can think of microstructures themselves as nothing but the shape, size, and distribution of interfaces. And there is more than one type of interface. And interfaces sometimes are classified as homophase and heterophase interfaces. A grain boundary, for example, which is an interface between the same phase, is a homophase interface. And the gamma prime interface or gamma carbide interface or gamma carbide interface. These are interfaces between two different phases. Those are heterophase interfaces. And one can also have interfaces between solids and melts, and solids and liquids, solids and vapors, between liquids, and so on and so forth. But all of us are familiar with microstructure, and all of us at that level look at interfaces day in and day out. And we also know that these interfaces are very important in determining the properties of the material. And most of our work is in actually tuning these interfaces. So one can think of all of material science from a completely interface perspective. So you can think of interface engineering and getting the required properties. So studying interfaces becomes very, very important. And one can go take a closer look at these interfaces. So that is what I wanted to show you in the next slide. So this is also a gamma prime gamma interface. So left side, this is gamma prime, and this is gamma. And these are compositions of 5 elements. So cobalt, titanium, chromium, aluminum, and manganese. I'm sorry about the quality of this figure. I couldn't get a better one. And let us look at the chromium composition, for example. At the gamma prime side, it is about 5 atomic percent. And then at the interface, it changes. And in the bulk gamma, you will see that it is about 25 atomic percent. So chromium preferably stays in gamma, and in gamma prime, you will have very low levels of chromium. And if you go very closely look at how the chromium composition is changing, you will see that it goes from this bulk value to this bulk value over a large distance. So you can see that if you say 0 is the point, and on either side, -1 on this side and +1 on that side, the composition changes from the bulk. After -1, it sort of becomes 5 atomic percent. So that you can say is bulk gamma prime. And you can look at this part and you see that it becomes 25. So you can say that that is bulk gamma. And where it is neither 5 nor 25, we say that this is the interface region. And I also want you to notice one more thing. And if you look at this red, I think, which is the aluminum, it need not have the same width when it changes. So there is this bulk value and there is this bulk value, and it doesn't have to take the same width for the other elements. So which brings us to the question. So when you say it's an interface, where is the interface? If you look at the different elements, for example, it looks like the interface width is different. Okay, so we'll come back to it. This is one of the problems that you have to think about if you're thinking about interfaces. One can say that, okay, so this is a system with multiple components, and so interface is wider in terms of the atomic composition. But if you look at structurally, maybe there is a very sharp interface. It is possible. Sometimes you can have structurally very sharp interfaces. But sometimes even in a purely structural sense, the interface can have a width. To show that, so here is a study done on multiple boundaries in color. And these are 2 grains that you see. And this colored region in between is a grain boundary. And it consists of 2 types of structures. One they call as pearl, the other one as domain. And so you can see that there is a definite width, and the bar that is here is the size that is 1 nanometer. Okay, so that is the kind of size that we are looking at. So obviously these regions, this structured grain boundary, has a specific width that can be seen from the scale bar. So scale bar is 1 nanometer. So it is slightly smaller than 1 nanometer, but it has a very specific width. So this is in the case of pure copper. And so we are not talking about composition. So structurally also the boundary can have a width. And of course, in real cases, it will have width both structurally and chemically, compositionally, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are two experimental microstructures that I wanted to show you. This is also common if you are doing simulations. So here is a microstructure that we have obtained from molecular dynamics simulations. This is from the unpublished work of Sushil. And this blue region that you see here is solid, and it is BCC because we are dealing with alpha iron here. And the colored region that you see on either side is basically iron melt. So this system is kept at the melting temperature of iron, and so the solid and liquid, the solid and the melt are in equilibrium. And so the actual system that we look at is schematically shown here. So you have melt, solid, and melt, and we use periodic boundary conditions. So this kind of structure is repeated. What you are seeing here is basically a section at the center. Okay, so that is what is shown here. And in order to show the solid and the melt, we have colored the atoms. And the coloring is done by looking at how many nearest neighbors are there for each atom. And because that number is 8 for BCC, anything with the 8 nearest neighbors is colored as blue. And anything which has more or less nearest neighbors is accordingly colored. And that is why in the liquid region, you see all sorts of colors, and in the solid you see only blue, except for some very rare atoms. Maybe there is a defect there, and that is why it shows less number of nearest neighbors, and so on. And this is supposed to be a nominally flat interface. And so this is going to be the geometry that we are going to keep in mind. So you have a sort of flat boundary that you can see, and that is what this boundary is. But it's only nominally flat. And if you look at this interface with time, you will see that it keeps fluctuating. And so in this case also, it's very clear that this is bulk melt and this is bulk solid. But where is the interface? It's slightly iffy. And one of the ways that you can identify where the interface is again looking at slice by slice. Let us say that we take one slice and look at all the atoms. And we know that if it is BCC, for example, at what position for every atom you should have the neighbors, and how many of them, and in which direction they will be there. So you can assume an ideal BCC structure, and you can go look at for every atom at those lengths whether you do see another atom. And if you don't, if you see atom at a different place, so you take this difference between the ideal structure and the actual structure that you have in the simulation, and you average for every atom in a slice. So you do this along this line and plot, and that is what is shown here. These data points, actually each data point, this data point, for example, corresponds to one layer of atoms, and all atoms in that layer we take, and we go to the 8 nearest neighbor positions, and we find out at what distance they are, and we compare those distances with the ideal BCC structure. And that difference is what is plotted here, and that sort of becomes an order parameter for us to locate the interface. So we have this data that is from the MD simulation at some given time point, and then we try to fit it to a parameter which is typically called as order parameter. So the 0 is the center of the simulation cell. So the 0 is somewhere here or somewhere here in the middle on this plane at the center. And then we try to fit it, and we see that here also the interface has a definite width, and that width is again about 20 angstroms in this case. It could be different for different systems, and in this case we find that it is anywhere between 15 to 20 angstroms. So like in experiments, it is also common to see such interfaces in simulations. And of course, theoretically, people have been thinking about such interfaces for a long time. So this is from a schematic of Bloch and Neal walls in magnetic materials. So this is the EC axis of magnetization. So the spin is preferred to either aligned opposite but parallel, or along the easy axis. Okay, so it is parallel or anti-parallel to the easy axis. Okay, and when the domains meet, suppose if you have a domain where all the spins are aligned downward, and if you have another domain where the spins are all aligned upward, there is a definite width over which the spin switches from this downward to this upward direction. And whether that rotation happens in the plane of the interface or perpendicular to the plane of the interface decides whether it is a block wall or Neal wall. And these were uh, proposed and understood from very long back, 1930s. Bloch and then Landau and Lifshitz, for example, developed a theory for magnetic domain structure by assuming that these interfaces have a definite width. So in theory also, you will see that interfaces are assumed to have a definite width. Okay, so the other point that I'm trying to show is that this is common. This is there in magnetic structures. This is there in solid melt structures. This is there in solid structures. This is there in structural sense. This is there in the chemical sense or compositional sense. So any which way you think about, the interfaces have definite width. And why is there a finite width for the interface? In the case of spin, it is easier to understand. In a magnetic material, the adjacent spins would like to align themselves in the same fashion. But if suppose two domains start and accidentally in one and in the other, the spins were aligned in opposite ways, when these two domains meet, which is where you get what is known as a domain wall, which is an interface, it's highly unfavorable for these two spins now to have opposite alignment. Okay, so they actually change gradually over some distance. But if you look at the distance over which the spins are changing, all these other spins are in a direction which is not favorable with respect to the easy axis, right? And same is true in this also. All these other spins are not in a favorable direction. So which means that in the magnetic domain theory, you will say that the interaction energy is higher, because it can reduce it if it aligns these two, for example, to be aligned in the same fashion, or these two to be aligned in the same fashion. But it is also not favorable for this alignment to be next to this alignment. So there is a competition between two factors. And so the system chooses an optimized distance over which spins change from one favorable alignment to the other. And like I said, this is a very old theory. Okay, so we can have an analogy to solid-solid interfaces in a similar fashion. For example, you can think of the up and down spins as A and B atoms. You can have AA or BB to be preferred. So that will be a phase separating system. In that case, an interface, when it forms, it will have all AB bonds. And the system doesn't prefer AB bonds. So it will go from AA to BB gradually. So it will have some AB bonds and more AB bonds and more AB bonds, and then finally it will go to BB bonds. Or some cases where AB bonds could be preferred. So that will be an ordering system, in which case when the interface forms, it will have all AA or BB bonds. Again, they are not favored. Okay, so what is the story so far? So interfaces, which are crucial microstructural features, they have definite width. It is seen in experiments and it is seen in simulations, and the models are built assuming that interfaces have a definite width. And interfaces with definite width are called diffuse interface because the interface is diffused over a region. Now, how to deal with diffuse interfaces when you're doing the thermodynamics and transport of materials? Okay, so that is what we want to discuss next. Okay, so we will look at thermodynamics and transport, keeping in mind that we have a system in which there is an interface.
Audio is not.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, it is fine. It is fine. Please continue.
Okay. Okay. So here is a schematic of an interface. There are two phases. So let us call it as phase one and phase two. And I'm plotting some property. In this case, it is called mass density. This is adapted from a modern course in transport phenomena by Veneris and Oettinger. And this is what actually it looks like in the system. And then we say, and that no, as you can see, this is also over some nanometer length scale is what this transition is happening. And we idealize this case and we say that okay, let's say that this continues, phase one continues up to some point and phase two continues up to some point. And so somewhere in this interface region we put a very sharp interface, so a plane with zero thickness. And then we say that this is where the interface is. So even though we know that the composition or mass density or whichever parameter you're looking at is not for either for the phase one or phase two value, we say that let us assume that it continues and there is a discontinuity at some plane, and that plane, whichever position you put that plane, that is supposed to be the interface. So this is a very classic way of looking at interfaces, and this is taught probably in undergraduate classes also. And this concept is due to Gibbs, and so this is known sometimes as a Gibbsian interface, even though there are others and there are modified versions of this. For example, where do you put the interface? So there are definitions. Or let us assume that it is not just one plane of zero thickness, but it happens over two planes, three planes, n planes. So there are many different ways in which it is done. Um, the only thing is we decide what is going to be the width of the interface. Okay, so if you assume that it is zero width, then it is known as a sharp interface. You can have diffuse interfaces, that is over several atomic layers or a small distance, if it is not if you're not looking at an atomistic picture. You can say that okay, so this interface has this particular width, but we are arbitrarily assigning that width, so that can also happen. But let's take this Gibbsian concept of putting an interface with a zero thickness. Okay, so this is an idealization, and so we are introducing a sharp interface as opposed to the diffuse interface, which is what you see actually. And this interface is an interface with a discontinuity, because when you come from the left and when you come from the right, it reaches different values for the parameter that you're looking at. Okay, so the dividing interface is the place where the two faces touch, and this location is not unique, right? I could have put this interface anywhere in that region. And once you put this interface, then you look at the any given property of the material in a system with this kind of idealized interface and without interface, and you take the difference, and the excess you say is because of the interface, and you attribute the excess to this interface. And this is the way we look at interfacial properties. You can I place this dividing interface in such a way that the integral under this continuous curve and the integral under these dotted curves are the same? Of course you can do that, and the problem is that if you do that, it is possible, but it is not unique. This is where you have to go back and think about the nickel-based superalloy picture that we had. Okay, you can do it for chromium, and maybe the interface is at some position, and then that will not work for aluminum. So the interface that you define in this fashion is not unique in that way. And there is also another problem, and the problem is with the Gibbs phase rule. So at that given under that given condition, there is a particular fraction. So the interface you have to put should be in such a way that this fraction of the faces should be correct. And if you do that, maybe you will not get the excess to be zero. Okay. So these are the issues. So, but this can be done, and this is a definition. And because there is this freedom to put the position of the interface wherever you want, and suppose it's a very bad drawing, but This is the best I could do. I could get the lines straight, but I couldn't get the profiles that well. So this is some property. Let's call it row 1 and row 2. And I first put an interface at this position, and I measure the excess associated with the interface. Then I move the interface position by a distance L, and I put the interface here, and I can measure the excess. And these two excesses will be related. So this is known as the gauge transformation, where you put the interface. And so you can see that the area under the dotted curve increases by L into rho 1 minus rho 2. So the rho excess, which would have been for the initial position of the interface, will become rho excess plus L into rho 1 minus rho 2. Okay. Now, if there are properties that are not affected by the exact location of the interface, then such properties are known as gauge invariant. And it's easy to see what those properties would be. For example, if you have the system in equilibrium at a given temperature, then whether you put the gauge here or there, it's not going to matter. The temperature is going to be the same. So you can say that temperature is a gauge invariant property. But if you're looking at excess enthalpy, for example, maybe it will not become zero. So it's not a gauge invariant property. So then you have to define your gauge, and depending on the definition. So that is why Gibbs is supposed to have said that when you make interfaces like this, there are two contributions. One depends on the bulk properties of the materials themselves. Other one is depending on where you put the interface. So there are two contributions to the interface excess that we measure. So Veneres and Oettinger, for example, develop full thermodynamics and transport using this kind of gauge transformation approach. It's very nice. There are two sets of 3 chapters, one with the classical thermodynamics, and then there is this thermodynamics with the interfaces introduced, and they do a very good job. So it's a nice book to look at if you are interested in this kind of thermodynamics. Now, here is an aside, and this approach is due to John Kahn. What Kahn showed is that you can avoid the Gibbsian interface construction if you also incorporate Gibbs-Duhem into your approach. The idea is as follows. So in Kahn's approach, you put one part of the interface line in the bulk of one phase, and the second one at the bulk of the other phase. It doesn't matter. You can go as much as you want into the bulk, because the way the equations are written and the Gibbs-Duhem incorporated, the bulk regions will give 0. And wherever you will get non-zero contribution, that portion you can determine as the interface. It's a very nice construction, and it's very neatly done. It's in a paper in 1979 called Thermodynamics of Solid Fluid Interfaces. Unfortunately, it's not as well known as I wish it to be. For example, Veneres and Oettinger do not make any reference to this approach at all. And it's very useful too. So if I wanted to get interfacial properties from my MD simulations of the type I was showing you, it's very difficult to say where the interface is, but it's very easy to identify clearly where the bulk is. And any formulation that allows me to go from one bulk to the other bulk region without having to worry about the width of the interface is really nice. Like I said, it's an aside. So there is this classical Gibbsian approach, and there are slightly better ways of doing it. But in any case, in all these cases, we are putting the interface width by hand. And of course, that was not acceptable to Kahn and Hilliard. So they had this objection that interface width should be determined by the system. It's not something that we should prescribe. So any interface where we define the interface width is not acceptable. So how is the width of a diffuse interface to be determined? How do you do the thermodynamics in such a way that it will automatically be decided by the system and it will not be prescribed by you? And that is the important contribution from the Kahn-Hilliard model. And to understand this, let's go back to the magnetic example that we were looking at. So if you have two spins next to each other, they are aligned in such a way that they reduce interaction energy. And this is, let's call it as the bulk energy. And when two domains meet, it's highly unfavorable for the spins to be aligned opposite to each other. And if they gradually change the direction, it's not so highly unfavorable. In other words, the gradients in spin, if you assume that it contributes to system energy, then you can see that where the spins are aligned opposite is like very high gradient or infinite gradient, and where it changes gradually is lower gradient. So if you assume that gradients in the system are also punished, then the interface width will be a competition between this bulk energy and the gradient energy, because bulk energy doesn't want any misalignment. But then if the gradient energy is very costly, it will allow as much of misalignment as to reduce the gradients, but still try to keep it mostly aligned, right? So in other words, this is what I have tried to schematically illustrate here. You can have all of them in one, all of them in the other spin. So there is a sudden jump here. This is not acceptable because the gradient contribution is going to blow here. You can make the gradient to be very small and slopey all over. So it will start from one bulk value to the other bulk value. And so in this case, it's like interface is there everywhere. Nowhere it is bulk. This is not also acceptable because most of these regions will contribute to the bulk energy, because bulk doesn't want these misalignments. So here is a compromise where you try to keep it aligned the most of the distance, and where you have to change, you take a particular distance. Over the distance you change. So automatically by these two competition between the bulk and the gradient energies, one can obtain the interface width. Okay. So this is the idea that Kahn and Hilliard also used. So like I said, there is a nice analogy between spins and A and B atoms, and so you can do the same thing, bulk and gradient, in terms of the A and B atoms, in which case you get a slightly modified version of the so-called regular solution model, right? So you take a binary alloy at constant temperature, assume that it prefers A and BB bonds. If you have discontinuity in composition, you will have large contribution from the gradient term, and you can have these AB bonds throughout the system, and that is also going to cost a lot in terms of the system preferring A or BB bonds, so it will try to avoid these AB bonds. And so the preferred profile will be an optimization between the two. So if you do this, so what are we doing mathematically speaking? So we know that there is a model which describes if you have AB bonds and what is the system free energy at constant temperature. So this is only a function of composition, right? So for example, we typically write it as omega xa xb plus RT epsilon xa plus 1 minus epsilon 1 minus xa. So that is the regular solution free energy at constant temperature. It is just a function of composition, and because it's a binary alloy, xb is equal to xa is equal to 1 minus xb, you can assume that it is just a function of composition. Whereas in the diffuse interface model of Kahn and Hilliard, we are saying that there are two contributions. One is coming from the composition itself, but any gradient in composition is also going to contribute to the energy. So the free energy becomes a completely different animal, mathematically speaking. So this is a function. This becomes a functional. So on function, you can do calculus. For example, if you wanted chemical potential, you will just take dou G by dou NB. That will give you the chemical potential. But if it is a functional, then to take this derivative, you have to do the variational derivative. So instead of calculus, you have to use variational calculus. Okay. Of course, it is possible to do the mathematics of the diffuse interface thermodynamics. And if you do, you can also go from such thermodynamics to transport. How do we go from thermodynamics to transport? We are going to use a constitutive law. And the constitutive law is typically Fick's law. So let's consider the generalized Fick's law, where we are saying that the flux of atoms is proportional to chemical potential gradients, and the constant or the proportionality constant is the mobility. But because this is a vector and mu is a scalar, so del mu is a gradient on a scalar, so this is also a vector, and these two vectors in general can be connected through a tensor. So this mobility can either be a scalar or it could be a second rank tensor. Okay. So you have the generalized fixed law, and you also include the law of conservation of mass. You will get a modified diffusion equation. The only thing that you see is that in the case where we have assumed that the interface is diffuse, so we incorporated the contribution that is coming from the gradients in composition. The chemical potential is now replaced by this variational derivative. So if you do in the regular case, it will be del m del mu. Mu was dou g by dou nd. That is what you would do if it is a regular solution model, and you would have written your diffusion equation. Now we have got a modified diffusion equation because it has this term that is coming from the gradient energy contribution. Okay, so it's a nice time again to take stock of what has happened. So we saw that interfaces are diffuse, and Gibbsian approach is a classical thermodynamic approach where we assume that this diffuse interface can be idealized by taking an interface of zero width. Sometimes there are other approaches which are same in spirit as Gibbs, which says that, okay, we can take it to be a specific width. So it's not really sharp interface, but you still prescribe the width of the interface. And Kahn and Hilliard developed a model which allows you to make no assumption about the interface width, and it is allowed by the system to choose for itself whatever interface width it prefers. And such an approach is known as diffuse interface approach, because we are allowing the interface to be diffuse and we are not prescribing the width of that interface. And so this is the story from the materials point of view. So you have interfaces, we know that they have definite width, and there has to be a way of incorporating it. And there are models using which you can incorporate, and you can deal with all the thermo transport, etc. But there is a nice thing that I like, which is that this way of thinking about interfaces as diffuse is useful, even if the interface is not diffuse. Okay, maybe you are dealing with a system in which there is a crack, or maybe you have some shock wave propagation. And we know that in these cases, there is actually a discontinuity, right? So there is a crack that has opened up in the bulk material, or there is this shock wave front. These are places of discontinuity. But even in those cases, it is useful sometimes to think of the interface to be diffuse, not very sharp, and avoid these discontinuities. Why and how? So that is a couple of slides that I want to talk about before I conclude this seminar. So this is a concept of interfaces, and this is very useful in solving partial differential equations. Okay. So to understand what we are talking about, let us consider a precipitate growing from a supersaturated solution. One can use classical fixed law based approach. So in the supersaturated matrix, the atoms are being ferried and they are brought to this interface. At the interface, the atoms make a jump and become part of the precipitate, and the precipitate grows. And once the atoms make the jump to the precipitate, inside the precipitate, again, it will diffuse or move around. And so you can divide the entire domain into precipitate domain and matrix domain. And you can solve diffusion equation in each domain. And at the interface, there is a jump in composition. Right? That is what our model has assumed. So you have this interface, and then there is a jump. And if you're solving diffusion equation, and if you're solving on these two domains, then you can see that what happens inside the interface from the precipitate side and from the matrix side has to be imposed as a boundary condition. Okay. So we are solving the diffusion equation to know where the interface is, because this is a precipitate growth problem. With time, the precipitate is growing or shrinking, so that the interface is moving. So we want to know where the interface is. So we want to solve the diffusion equation on the precipitate domain and the matrix domain. But to solve it, we have to know where the interface is. Okay, so this is sort of circular problem. I need to solve the diffusion equation. For that, I need the boundary condition. For that, I need to know where